Again, as with last chapter, massive trigger warning for child abuse, homophobia, transphobia, trauma, and the like. Hello, and welcome to Chapter 6 of Hogwarts Bouquet by ElizabethEmerald, a trans Harry Potter fanfic on AO3. Chapter 6 is titled, A Meeting of the Minds, and if my voice sounds a little bit different, it is currently 3:30 a.m. Alright, Rose, we'll be returning to Hogwarts in a couple of days, and you'll be coming with us, Minerva said. Rose had helped her make a small breakfast that the three of them were sharing. I think you'll really like living in Hogwarts. It's a castle, Poppy said, excitement in her voice. Rose's eyes were shining with light, a broad smile on her face. Since her birthday and receiving Posy, Rose had been doing much better. Whenever Rose was focusing on a task, Posy would stand or sit behind her, then make a small growl whenever Poppy or Minerva came up behind her, which helped her to not be so startled. Then, the few times Rose still ended up having a panic attack, Posy was quick to stand over her to protect her. They were all happy with their progress as a pair. Now, there are a few things you'll need to remember while you are in the castle, Minerva said. She and Poppy had already discussed in depth the precautions they would be taking while Rose was there. Certainly Hogwarts was the safest location for Rose to be. She would be surrounded by staff who thought of her as Poppy's great niece. They would all do their best to protect her and keep her safe. No Death Eater would dare attack her there, they hoped. There were, however, a few major threats they would have to be aware of. The easiest were the inherent risks of the castle, like the Black Lake or the Forbidden Forest. They had already told her that she was not to go near them. The most difficult to avoid was, of course, the headmaster himself. When you are in the castle, do your best to stay away from Professor Dumbledore. He is an accomplished legilimate, so he has the ability to delve into your thoughts. However, as long as you avoid eye contact as much as possible and keep your distance, you will be safe. Rose nodded bravely, though they could both see the apprehension on her face. Posy gave a soft whine and set her heavy head in Rose's lap. Rose glanced down at her familiar before burying her hands in the dog's fur. Minerva smiled as the tension in Rose's shoulders eased with Posy's help. It's too bad we don't have time to teach you occlumency. Maybe once we are settled in the castle we can talk to Professor Snape. He's an occlument. Perhaps he can teach you some things, Poppy said. If Professor Dumbledore reads my mind, will he send me back to the Dursleys? Rose asked in a quiet voice. Posy whined again before growling. We will not let him, Minerva said, iron in her voice. If he ever finds out what your name used to be, we will not allow him to place you back where you will be harmed. He may be powerful, but we have our means to keep him away from you. That's right. Neither of us are going to let your awful relatives hurt you again, Poppy said. Posy barked in what seemed to be agreement. However, it will be much easier if he just doesn't find out till much later. The longer we can delay that, the better for all of us. They could both see how seriously she was taking this discussion. They didn't want to scare her or add more to the already crushing weight of her anxiety, but they also couldn't stand to have her get hurt again. They had agreed that it would be better, by far, for her to be aware of the dangers and thus ready to face them, than caught unaware by something they had tried and failed to shelter her from. Good. As long as you understand that, there shouldn't be too many problems. We will have to briefly meet Albus when we first arrive back at the castle, but as long as you remember what we've taught you, we all should get out of there quickly. Then you'll be staying in the hospital wing with me. Unfortunately, Minnie and I don't have shared quarters currently. Minerva did her best not to groan at Poppy's smirk. Technically, couples could get a shared room. However, there were some ancient bylaws that made it difficult for same-sex couples to live together and keep their employment. Plus, with their differing duties, neither felt comfortable with leaving their posts. Not that Poppy ever stopped sassing Minerva about their living arrangements. In truth, Minerva had quite enjoyed having Poppy over every night since she had rescued Rose. There was something special about coming home to her every day and waking up with her in the mornings. Maybe once Rose was safe, she would take the next step with Poppy. The last thing we need to do before we leave is to apply the transfigurations that will be your disguise. They will last about 10 days, so we will reapply them every week. Are you ready, Rose? Rose smiled and clapped her hands. Posy made a happy huffing noise, her tail wagging a little. Glamour time was one of Rose's favorite activities. She loved playing around with her appearance, choosing different looks based on her mood. Though her favorite was the first that Minerva had chosen for her, the one that made her look like she could be Poppy and Minerva's daughter. Minerva crept a smile over her features, seeing how excited Rose still was at the disguise magic. She couldn't wait till Rose got a wand of her own, so she could teach her some of these spells. As was per usual, Minerva gave Rose sandy brown hair, though she let it keep its natural texture. Rose wrinkled her nose as her eyes changed color, the sensation tickling, but not wanting to throw off the magic. Minerva next made some small adjustments to Rose's face shape. This kind of transfiguration didn't allow for any major changes to bone structure without causing lasting damage, but she was at least able to add some more feminine features, at least until Poppy got back to the school and was able to start her on some gender-affirming potions. All right, all done. Minerva smiled and clapped her hands together. Rose cheered, dashing off to the mirror to look at herself again. Let's grab our bags. I want to leave for Hogwarts with enough time to get settled in the hospital wing, Poppy said, a wide smile on her face as well. She pressed a kiss to Minerva's cheek, then whispered, Amazing job, Aunt Minnie. Minerva snorted, then all three of them prepared to flew back to the Hogwarts hospital wing. Albus Dumbledore was a very busy man. He had both his responsibilities as headmaster of Hogwarts School in Witchcraft and Wizardry, and his political responsibilities, not to mention the many hidden pursuits he used to try to prepare for what he felt was the inevitable return of Lord Voldemort. He was sure that the Dark Lord had not truly died that night at the Potters, and it was only a matter of time before he made some attempt to regain his position of power. He was currently in the process of writing another letter to Nicholas Flamel, as the only wizard who had managed to create the Philosopher's Stone. He had an enormous target on his back. The stone simply could not be allowed to continue to exist. It was the most surefire way for Voldemort to return to power. He had managed to convince Nicholas to keep the stone in a specialized vault at Gringotts. That at last had moved the target and pressure of protecting the stone from Flamel and placed it on the goblins of the bank. However, it was only a matter of time before their defenses were breached. If it was possible, Dumbledore would gladly have the stone moved to Hogwarts, where he could personally oversee its protection. Of course, it was in the school that would move the target to a building filled with underage students, half of them barely knew which end of their bloody wands a spell came out of, which would work quite well at drawing out any allies of Voldemort's who would want to make an attempt at the stone. Whichever Death Eater came for the stone could be apprehended and questioned about the Dark Lord's return, and it would provide the motivation to Flamel to destroy the stone. An even greater benefit is that by the time Dumbledore convinced Flamel to move the stone to the castle, Harry Potter would be attending the school himself. Dumbledore was sure he could encourage the boy to pursue the stone as well. Harry would gain valuable skills from facing the traps he and the staff would utilize to protect the stone, and it would provide greater motivation for Harry to despise Voldemort and his followers, knowing the threat posed to his fellow students by the Death Eaters. There was always the risk, however, that one of the other students might perish when whatever evil would come find its way to the castle. That was a risk he was willing to take. The lives of a few students were inconsequential if it meant that Dumbledore's champion was ready to face Voldemort when the time came. Speaking of his champion, Albus glanced at another correspondence on his desk. Arabella had sent yet another owl about how the boy had apparently disappeared from the care of his relatives. He wanted to roll his eyes. He knew for a fact that Vernon and Petunia Dursley regularly locked him in the cupboard under the stairs, sometimes for weeks at a time. Harry had likely just performed some act of accidental magic that his uncle was punishing him for. Dumbledore knew fully well that Petunia would never willingly allow Harry to leave her care. The frequent isolations and starvation inflicted on the boy were just another price Dumbledore had to pay. Harry would arrive at Hogwarts desperate for any escape from his relatives. Dumbledore, being the only who could offer that escape, would have Harry's unquestioning loyalty. A sharp knock at the door brought his head up. He flicked his wrist, a motion that to the untrained eye would seem a simple stretch of someone who had been writing long hours with a quill. It actually triggered a number of enchantments around his office. The single motion locked certain cabinets, turned some documents invisible, while filling others with nonsense letters to wizarding publications. Dumbledore had spent years in the careful art of subterfuge, and that meant having layers and layers of protections around him so his plans wouldn't be discovered. With the final elements of his most important work hidden away, the door to his office opened to reveal Poppy Pomfrey, Minerva McGonagall, a small girl, mostly hidden behind Poppy's skirts, and a large black dog. Ah, yes, some relative of Poppy's had passed, and their child would be coming to live in the castle. Dumbledore already full planned on approving their request for the child to stay with her great-aunt until it was time for her to attend Hogwarts as a student, though he still insisted on meeting her. While Madame Pomfrey introduced the child and explained the scenario, Dumbledore used his legilimency to drift across the minds of those present. Dumbledore was one of the most skilled legilimens in the world. He constantly used his skills to enter the minds of those around him. How else would he be able to predict attacks or find weaknesses he could exploit? For the most part, with his staff, he only focused on their surface emotions, not wanting to risk detection as he shuffled through their mind. Poppy's emotions rolled with grief and anxiety. Not terribly surprising, just considering that she had lost a member of her family recently, and now is to be responsible for a young child. Just beneath that feeling was Poppy's appreciation of Minerva's presence, grateful for her support. Dumbledore knew about the dalliances between the two women. As long as they didn't let their feelings distract from their respective positions, he felt no need to confront them. He also felt no need to try and lift the bylaw that prevented them from moving in together. He could hang it over their heads like a carrot if he wanted to. He always kept tabs on how they were feeling, so that if he needed to, he could use their feelings for each other as a lever to get them to fall in line with whatever he needed. He could only gaze at the absolute edge of Minerva's mind. Her words were ironclad, not unbreachable walls like Severus's, but alert to any trespass. She had shouted at him on more than one occasion for prying. The most he could glean from her is that she was worried, probably about the young girl there. Rose Pomfrey, as she was introduced, was an interesting case. She looked younger than 10 with how small she was. Her fingers were tangled in the fur of the service animal Poppy had mentioned. The dog stood half in front of her, likely so she wasn't overwhelmed with her emotions. Emotions that Dumbledore could feel without difficulty. She kept her eyes clamped on the ground, not allowing him any entry with his legitimacy. However, her emotions were blasting out of her. Her fear was so powerful that it was only the decades of studying people around him in this exact manner that kept Dumbledore from showing any reaction. She was absolutely terrified out of her mind. He wanted to dive deeper, unwind the mystery of her mind. "Rose is a very pretty name," Dumbledore said, keeping his voice gentle. Rose looked up, a small smile on her face. Children always like to be complimented. Dumbledore kept his smirk inside as he immediately locked eyes with her. He shredded past the fear that was her only defense from his intrusion in her mind. What could this girl be so afraid of? He had a glimpse of a large, meaty hand raised in preparation of a blow. Then, with a snarl and a thunderous bark, his connection to her mind was shattered. He felt as if a powerful bite had clamped down on his mind, enormous jaws closing in around him. He threw up his own occlumency wards, and felt them almost get battered down again in the moment of furious magic that attacked his mind. Poppy and Minerva had both stopped talking as the girl's dog, no, her familiar, growled and barked. Now she could see its true form, a church grim. The dog had grown larger, now standing shoulder to shoulder with Rose. Its eyes burned red like coals, and its black coat seemed to fade into fog that suddenly filled the office. Dumbledore felt a chill sweep across his spine as if someone had just walked across his grave. He desperately mumbled his permission for Rose to stay in the castle as Poppy's ward. Minerva quickly ushered them out of the office. The Grim was the last to leave, glaring at him all the while, eyes still burning. When it finally reached the door of the office, the Grim vanished, again taking the form of a black Labrador, before running down the stairs after Rose. Dumbledore took a moment to gather himself. Rose Pomfrey was certainly very interesting. She must have a tremendous amount of magic to be able to have a Grim as a familiar. He would have to investigate her some more, see if he can get her away from the dog long enough to truly explore her mind. If she was to be attending Hogwarts next year, she might be able to make a strong ally for Harry Potter if he could arrange it. Of course, if she was a danger to his champion, he would have to intervene. Thank you for listening to this chapter. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.